Hey there, tonight Lee entered the tomb. Not one of those wide-open tourist walkthroughs with rope barriers and signs pointing to gift shops. No, tonight you're crawling through a narrow stone shaft under the desert. It smells like old air, dry and ancient, a little metallic. Your fingers graze the carved limestone walls, cool to the touch, still echoing with a silence that feels alive. And up ahead, there's something waiting. Not just a body, but a life. Carefully preserved, wrapped tight, sealed away from time. Or so they thought. Because if you were hoping every mummy ever buried in Egypt stayed resting peacefully in their golden coffin, you probably won't survive this story. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always comforting to see who else is up with us at midnight, at 2 a.m. just letting the mind drift. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're crouched low in the Valley of the Kings, not in the famous tomb of Tutankhamun with its neatly roped-off treasures. You're in a forgotten side chamber, long since looted, its hieroglyphs half chipped away, and right there, half buried in rubble, lies a desiccated hand still wearing a gold ring. A time capsule with a pulse, but how many of these were truly left untouched? Because here's the truth. Ancient Egyptians mummified millions. Not thousands, millions. Human and animal. From pharaohs to farmers, cats to crocodiles. An entire spiritual economy built around preserving flesh for eternity. But eternity didn't last. You imagine the first tomb robbers, maybe two skinny men with torches, one muttering that the curse is fake, the other already swinging a pickaxe at a painted door. They weren't waiting for empires to fall. They started looting as soon as the tombs were sealed. Archaeologists today estimate that most tombs were robbed within a generation of burial. So even before mummies became modern curiosities, they were already being dragged from their sanctuaries, stripped of amulets, tossed aside in the rush for gold. Sometimes, if the family was poor, the mummification was done with shortcuts, inadequate resin, minimal linen, improper drying. You didn't want to be one of those. Historians still argue whether the rush to quantity over quality in Egypt's later dynasties was due to economic decline or religious fervor gone corporate. Either way, the result was the same. A lot of poorly wrapped corpses, easy to plunder, easy to rot. Now fast forward a few hundred years. The Roman Empire strolls into town, sandals dusted, scrolls tucked under their arms. And they are absolutely fascinated by this whole preserving bodies forever business. We have letters from Roman tourists describing their visits to the Great Pyramids, already ancient by their time. Some took relics home, others just stared. One Roman noblewoman famously brought her guests into a dinner party, showed them an unwrapped mummy in the corner of the atrium, and said, "This was someone's grandmother." Probably not in Latin, but you get the idea. For them, Egyptian burial customs were exotic, charming, even a little funny, because the Romans believed in burning bodies, ashes to ashes. But in Egypt, death was a permanent appointment. So you didn't just die, you got styled. High priests would perform rituals, chant spells from the Book of the Dead, pack your nose with linen, your belly with natron. And if you were lucky, your heart was left intact. If not, well, someone might have slipped a beet-shaped stone in there instead. You shuffle along the corridor and arrive at another chamber. This one's empty, mostly. A single wooden coffin lies broken on its side. The sarcophagus lid has been shoved against the wall. But something glints under the dust traces of blue paint that once formed an eye. A watchful gaze painted onto the coffin, meant to guide the soul into the afterlife. It guided the body somewhere else instead, because after the Romans came the Byzantines, then the Arabs, then the French, then the British. then the archaeologists, then the tourists, and each one took their turn in removing, breaking, exporting, or studying what lay behind these sealed doors, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, you press deeper into the dark. Your candle flickers, your breath fogs slightly in the cooler air. You try to imagine what it was like when these halls were fresh, newly carved, polished, fragrant with myrrh and incense. When priests stood here, whispering spells, tucking golden scarabs under layers of linen, not an invitation for curiosity. When death was a promise, and yet curiosity always wins. That's how we begin, not with a pyramid, but with a question. Where do they all go? Millions of mummies, gone, stripped, burned, eaten, ground up, unwrapped at parties, shipped off to Europe in crates. Lost in shipwrecks, misfiled in museum basements, mistaken for relics of saints, fed to furnaces, hung in apothecaries, stuck behind glass, still waiting or simply somewhere beneath your feet. You take a slow step back from the wall. Dust drifts in the torchlight. The silence here isn't empty, it's watching, and now we begin to unroll the story. You step carefully around scattered pottery shards, the fragments of a once carefully sealed offering. The air is drier now. Your footsteps echo differently. You're not alone, exactly, though. It's not a person you feel behind you. It's history. Centuries of hands reaching back, brushing against the sacred and calling it. Fascinating, because once the tombs were breached, what followed wasn't just looting, it was obsession. The Greeks and Romans weren't just curious visitors. They were the first in a long, long line of people who saw Egypt not as a sovereign culture, but as an ancient wonderland they were entitled to explore, take from, and reinterpret for their own amusement. You stop before a crumbling wall relief. The paint's mostly faded, once vivid ochres and lightest blues, now soft grays and dust tones. But you can still make out the shape of a figure offering a bowl to a seated god. A prayer in stone. The Greeks saw scenes like this and reimagined them. They folded Egyptian gods into their own pantheon, declaring Isis a version of Demeter, Horus a stand-in for Apollo, and mummies? Well, those were props, curiosities, tokens of a mysterious wisdom they didn't quite understand, but were eager to possess. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote about mummification with a mix of awe and inaccuracy, describing brains pulled out through the nose, and ceremonies filled with weeping women and sacred oils. He painted a picture so vivid it became the picture for centuries. The Romans followed suit. They didn't just admire mummies, they imported them. We have records of Roman elites in Egypt commissioning their own mummifications, Egyptian-style Roman face. Literally. Some were wrapped in linen like locals, but had painted portraits, naturalistic, full color, striking, big eyes, rosy cheeks, realism instead of stylized formality. You imagine walking through one of those cemeteries, rows of bodies stacked underground, their faces peering up from painted panels like they're about to speak. It's haunting, it's beautiful, and it's weirdly intimate. These weren't just tombs. They were experiments in identity, a fusion of two empires, Greek and Roman, layered over a distinctly Egyptian tradition. Historians still argue whether this cultural crossover was an act of reverence or appropriation. Were they honoring Egyptian customs, or simply co-opting them to feel exotic and timeless? You duck into a side chamber, this one smaller, with just a few shelves carved into the walls. Once, each niche would have held a small coffin, maybe a cat or ibis, maybe a child. It's empty now. And maybe it's just the wind outside, but you hear a faint rustle like linen moving. Your brain says draft, your gut says memory. By the time the Byzantine Empire rose from the ashes of Rome, mummification was already in decline. Christian doctrine frowned on preserving the dead, favoring decay and resurrection, so the old ways faded. But the bodies remained. Sometimes monks would stumble on mummies and mistake them for early Christian martyrs. Wrapped, serene, clearly special, relics perhaps. You picture a confused abbot discovering a mummy in the sand and declaring, "This must be Saint somebody," then lighting candles around it. Even centuries later, when the Arab world inherited Egypt, mummies still fascinated travelers and scholars. Some Islamic texts describe them with respect, others with disdain. They were neither holy nor completely dismissed, just peculiar leftovers of a lost faith. By the 12th century, mummies began appearing in Europe again, not as religious relics, but as medicine. They were ground up, bottled, and sold, not as snake oil. As genuine, doctor-approved treatment, this wasn't fringe. This was mainstream medieval pharmacy. You pause there, blinking. Imagine having a headache in 15th century London, and your apothecary hands you a vial and says, "Here, try some powdered Egyptian noblewoman." People believed that the essence of the preserved, especially those embalmed with exotic resins, carried healing powers. They called it mummia, not the word for a person, but a product. And here's the kicker, some of the mummy sold in apothecaries wasn't he even real? Once supply couldn't keep up with demand, dealers started faking it. They roasted modern corpses, added pitch and myrrh, then ground them up. Fake ancient bodies. For medicine. You walk further, now through a passageway so narrow you have to turn sideways. It smells like age and saltpeter. Like old parchment and decayed cloth. You feel the weight of centuries on your back. This wasn't just a few curious tourists. This was a global obsession. Egyptian mummies went from being religious icons to exotic decor, to medicinal product, to travel souvenir. Their stories warped, their names were lost, and their faces became collectible, and through it all, they waited, layered in linen, folded in silence, watching as strangers passed through, eager to own something ancient, even if they didn't understand what they were holding. Because once a mummy left its tomb, it wasn't a person anymore. It was a commodity, and the next stop on this strange journey, right into someone's pocket. You emerge empty except for a shattered pottery jar, its label long lost if it ever had one, into your hand trailing along the wall, tracing flaking paint. Larger chamber, now one with painted in a time when death wasn't an ending. The people of early modern Europe had a different use for the dead, but a continuation. Higher ceilings and faded frescoes curling up the walls, internal bleeding, bruises, and even lovesickness. Like dried leaves, wrapped in brocade, arriving at her physician's with a pallid look and fainting couch flare. At the center lies a low stone platform, though. But you don't need a label. Retrieves a vial and dabs a bit of pulverized farro under her tongue. "I'm simply exhausted," the physician nods solemnly. It wasn't just nobles. Doctors prescribed it for headaches. If you can call it that, went like this. Yes, love sickness. The logic, these people were preserved with exotic herbs and sacred rites. Their flesh must retain some healing force. So ingesting it would pass that vitality to you. Mummy as medicine. A truly bone-chilling smoothie. One German physician reportedly wrote, "If a man cannot retain his health through prayer, subtle and slightly cannibalistic." Historians still argue how widespread actual mummy consumption was, whether it was limited to elite circles or common across Europe. What's clear is this: a cure. It happened. Warm, earthy, and it persisted for centuries. Even Shakespeare referenced it, mummy, as a balm. People believed in its power. They wanted to own it, eat it, absorb it. Unintentional reburial. And when actual mummies became scarce, you guessed it, enter the forgers. Bodies were stolen from local graves, dried in ovens, stained with pitch and spice, then labeled authentic Egyptian. Somewhere, tourists walk past they don't know are hollow. An entire black market of counterfeit corpses. You run your fingers across the section of stone where the paint is gone, smoothed by time or maybe by thieves. Maybe by the man who once took the real mummy that lay here, devoured, unwrapped it by candlelight with his guests, then burned the remains in his fireplace, forgotten, and you begin to notice something. Fully wrapped, being sold at auction in England, a strange irony. The ancient Egyptians had gone to immense lengths to preserve bodies for eternity. They built pyramid tombs, painted entire books on walls, filled crypts with amulets and offerings, all to ensure the soul's safe passage. Immobile, past the larger, more formal chambers, into corridors that twist without symmetry. Unchanging, and then, 1,000 years later, those same bodies were being ground into powder and snorted off silver trays. You can't help but chuckle softly, not out of disrespect but disbelief, because the human journey from reverence to novelty is rarely subtle. But the powdered craze wasn't the end of it. Soon, people weren't content to just eat history, but never quite gone. They wanted to own it, display it, pass it around at parties. You brush away a bit of sand from the floor and find a small scarab amulet ceramic, palm-sized, still tinted green-blue. What used to be one, industrial. It would have rested near a heart once. Now it's just a trinket. You imagine the buyers of such trinkets aristocrats with curiosity cabinets, filled with beetles, bones, mummified hands. All labeled, rarely understood, because in Europe, Egyptomania was in full swing. Napoleon's campaign in Egypt at the turn of the 19th century sparked a frenzy. Suddenly, everyone wanted a piece of the Nile, but his offerings. And as traders realized what European buyers were willing to pay, embalmed and handed over with a small fee, they began exporting mummies by the boatload. Some were still wrapped, carefully labeled. Others? Well, imagine a crate full of bones and cloth, delivered to a drawing room in Paris with a polite note, a finique, merci. Apothecaries kept jars of mummy powder. Collectors displayed entire corpses in their homes. Even painters bought powdered mummy to mix into a special brown pigment called, wait for it, mummy brown. Just something to do after dessert. Because the obsession wasn't just about owning a piece of history. It was about controlling it, reducing it, repackaging death into curiosity. And behind all of it, quiet, were the mummies themselves, waiting, silent, crumbling. You move deeper into the earth now. This isn't the royal quarter. No golden sarcophagi or walls etched with delicate spells. This place feels functional, and it is. Because not all mummies were kings or queens. Some were animals. Millions of them. You stop at a side alcove, an underground catacomb filled wall to wall with animal mummies. Millions of them. Cats, falcons, ibises, crocodiles, bulls. All preserved, all buried. You can still walk there today, torchlight flickering across shelves, stacked 10 deep with linen bundles, each one's containing something sacred. But here's the twist. Many of them were empty. Historians still argue whether the animal mummy industry became corrupt over time, whether priests knowingly sold fake offerings to trusting worshippers. Fur and forgotten hopes. 10 feet long, its jaw permanently clenched in a linen snarl. X-rays of hundreds of animal mummies revealed shocking results. Some contained only feathers or a single bone. Or nothing at all, a scam, or a symbolic gesture never meant to deceive. No one agrees. But one thing is clear, as demand for animal mummies skyrocketed, supply couldn't keep up. Fertility, health, protection, and somewhere between devotion and capitalism. The system broke, layer by layer. You crouch beside a small pit now. The floor is littered with scraps linen, twine, old wood. You pick one up, but memory, a fragment of a tag. Faint hieroglyphs etched in ink. It might have said, based its blessing, or simply sold. Because by the late period of Egyptian history, The mummification of animals had become a booming economy. Temples hired entire teams, embalmers, hunters, priests, craftsmen. Imagine the production line: catch a sacred ibis, sacrifice it, dry the body in natron, wrap it in linen, paint its bundle, insert it into a jar or wooden coffin, sell it to a worshiper as a token of devotion. It's reverent, it's tragic, it's mass production with incense. And just like the humans, those animal mummies didn't stay buried. In the 19th century, European industrialists discovered the massive underground vaults filled with animal mummies and saw not sacred offerings, but cheap fertilizer. Tons of mummified cats and birds were shipped to Britain, ground up, and spread on English farmland. You blink. Yes, Egyptian mummies once nourished British turnips. That's not hyperbole. That's a shipping manifest. One British newspaper in the 1890s reported the arrival of 180,000 cat mummies in Liverpool. They were auctioned off. Some ended up in museums, most ended up in fields. You glance at your hands. They're covered in dust now. Sometimes entire pits are found with no coffins, just layered remains, one on top of another. A dense archive of faith. You walk slowly now, careful not to disturb the bones beneath your boots. One skeleton protrudes from the wall, a crocodile. It would have once lounged in the sacred waters of the Nile, worshipped as Selbik, god of fertility and military prowess. Now it's entombed, guarding a hallway no one visits. There's something profoundly sad about it. These weren't just animals, they were messages. People came to temples with prayers for love. They offered the life of another being, wrapped it in care, and left it for the gods, and then centuries passed. And the meaning peeled away, linen by linen, until all that remained was dust. You press your palm against the cool wall. It vibrates faintly, not with sound. The underground world of animal mummification was vast. A network of burials stretching beneath Egypt's surface like veins, and we only know a fraction. Most of it is still out there, sleeping, silent, waiting, and as you walk on, you wonder, who will dig them up next? And what will they do with what they find? Your steps echo louder now. The tunnel widens again, and you feel the ground slope subtly upward. The air shifts, less still, less sacred. You're rising from the tombs, yes, but not into sunlight. Instead, you're heading toward the 19th century, toward parlors, fireplaces, and gaslit drawing rooms, and mummies torn from their resting places and put on display. Because if there was one thing the British Empire loved more than discovering ancient history, it was owning it. You run your hand along a stone ledge, its edge sharp from a recent break. This one wasn't worn down over centuries. It was hacked recently, comparatively speaking, a crowbar, maybe, a careless boot. Because when the Victorians entered the scene, tombs weren't opened with reverence, they were plundered. The great age of archaeology, so often painted as a noble pursuit of knowledge, was, at its core, a scramble. A colonial race to collect the past, to box it up, to label it, and to ship it back to London. You close your eyes. You can almost hear it, the clatter of crates being nailed shut, the jostle of camel caravans, and the quiet, resigned sighs of the dead as they were loaded aboard steamships bound for Europe. Once in Britain, the mummies were no longer individuals. They became objects, exhibits, even party favors. Unwrapping parties became a social trend. Imagine it, a dinner party in a townhouse off Kensington High Street. Candles flickering, guests sipping sherry. And in the center of the room, on a long table, a real mummy, its wrapping slowly undone by a gentleman in white gloves and scholarly affectation. He reads aloud as he cuts the linen. The crowd leans in. Someone faints. Someone else claps. Historians still debate whether this was true scientific inquiry or something closer to performance art, a macabre entertainment masked as education. You may guess where most fall on that argument. Of course, not all mummies were unwrapped. Some were placed in museums, left intact, but rarely labeled correctly, often not labeled at all. You pass by a replica sarcophagus now, its sides painted with generic symbols. No name, no story, just a vague sense of ancientness. The British Museum still holds hundreds some on display, others in storage. Most were taken during a time when Egypt had no say in the matter, colonial extraction at its finest. And here's a detail you might not expect. Some of those mummies were never meant to be seen. They were buried in secrecy. Ordinary people, children, poor families who pooled resources to afford a simple embalming. Not priests, not kings, just people. Their greatest hope was to rest undisturbed for eternity. Instead, they became shelf items in glass cases, or worse, they were misfiled. Their wrappings reused, their names lost. You imagine walking into a museum storage room, rows upon rows of human remains, all cataloged, boxed, some only partially studied. The faces beneath the bandages are invisible, unknowable. Yet still they're there, beneath fluorescent lights, surrounded not by prayers, but by silence and paperwork. One particularly striking example, a mummy in the British Museum, long believed to be an anonymous priest, was revealed by modern scans to be a young woman in her 20s, pregnant, likely middle class. Her name, if ever recorded, was lost long ago. But now we know a little more. A tiny sliver of her story recovered from the scans of her pelvis, the twist of her arms, the curve of her spine. But for every mummy re-examined with care, there are countless others who remain unidentified, or worse, on display with entirely fabricated backstories. A practice that continues. Many museums still struggle with how to present mummies. Do they deserve a name? Do they deserve reburial? Historians, archaeologists, and curators still debate whether displaying mummies is respectful or exploitative. Is it education or is it voyeurism? Some institutions have started to remove mummies from public view, or at least to offer greater context, to treat them as people, not just relics. You pause at the edge of a small niche, just enough space for a child's burial. The room is silent again. And yet, in the quiet, 1,000 voices seem to murmur at once. Voices from 4,000 years ago, and voices from 140 years ago, and voices from now still trying to decide what we owe the dead. Because these were not artifacts, not puzzles to be solved or novelties to be bought. They were once loved. They were mourned. They were carried to their tombs with care, tears falling on the linen as it was wrapped, and now they lie far from home. Not in tombs, but in drawers, on shelves, in basements, watching. Still, you pause at a bend in the corridor. The stone beneath your feet is smoother here, worn down not by ancient priests, but by modern boots, a sign of recent visitors. Archaeologists, perhaps, or looters, maybe both. Because for all the reverence we pretend to have for history, we've been disturbingly willing to chip it apart for personal gain. You take a breath, slow and shallow, and step into the next chamber. This one is strangely empty, a white space. A low ceiling, only the faintest smell of old earth and something else. Paper, not scrolls or papyri, though those too were once pillaged. This scent belongs to books, the kind that sat on European desks. Inside, lines inked in Latin or French or English. And in the margins, traces of something far older, mummy powder. Yes, in the 17th and 18th centuries, people didn't just consume ground mummies for health. They also used the remains for ink. You blink? Imagine writing a love letter with powdered pharaoh, or documenting church records on the back of what once held someone's lungs. Absurd, of course, but it happened. You lean against a column and think back through dusty records and hushed legends about how European scientists and alchemists searched for miracles inside the dead. The mummy they bought was thought to carry not just healing power, but magical essence. A residue of eternity, perhaps, even if it was occasionally faked with boiled pitch and dead goats. Historians still argue whether early modern apothecaries knew they were selling fraudulent mummy products, or whether they truly believed in what they offered. A little from column A, a little from column B, but beyond medicine and pigment, there was another use, one even more surreal. And yes, more disrespectful. Fuel. You step deeper into the room. It's darker here, the walls crumbling. And in the center, a low, broken frame of what might have been a train axle. The story goes like this. In the 1800s, during the height of Egyptomania, an American railway company allegedly bought a large shipment of Egyptian mummies, not for study, not for display, but for burning. Wood was expensive, coal had to be mined, but mummy linen? Dry, resin-soaked, and free if you had the right shipping contract. According to legend, the train operator claimed that mummy rags burned brighter and longer than timber. Efficient, economical, and somehow not illegal. Now, before you picture an entire train chugging across the prairie powered by ancient royalty, let's pause. Historians still debate whether this tale is fact or Victorian myth. No shipping manifests have been found, no train logs. Just a few newspaper mentions, a line or two in old memoirs. And yet it feels true, because it fits the time. A moment when history was being bought, consumed, and thrown into the fire, sometimes literally. You crouch beside a scatter of ash and think whether or not the railway tale is factual. We know for certain that mummies were burned as fuel in other ways. Some were tossed into kilns, used to heat homes, used to cook food, used to smelt metal. Because when something is seen as plentiful, people rarely ask what it once meant. They just use it. That's how we got mummy brown. That's how we got mummy medicine. That's how we got fertilizer from sacred burials. And if a railway operator in 1860 thought it made good firewood, who at the time would have stopped him? You rise, brushing the dust from your knees, and take another slow step forward. The further we get from the source, the easier it becomes to turn lives into materials. What was once a person becomes pigment, becomes powder, becomes fuel. And the memory of who they were, that disappears. You look up. A narrow shaft lets in a single beam of light, slicing through the dust. Tiny particles dance in the air, illuminated for just a moment, before fading into shadow again. That, you think, is what most mummies became. Not royalty, not legend, just dust. Drifting through time, occasionally catching the light, then disappearing once more. You follow that beam of light until it fades behind a bend in the tunnel, where even the dust seems to settle differently. The air is cooler here, still ancient, but less funerary. No more spices or resins, just stone and silence. And a different kind of burial, because not all mummies come from grand tombs. And not all stories begin in Egypt. You crouch slightly to step through a lower arch. On the other side, something unexpected. The walls change. They're softer, crumbly, hewn from volcanic tuff. The air smells of mildew, wax, and faint candle smoke. You're beneath Rome now. Welcome to the catacombs. Hundreds of kilometers of tunnels, chiseled out beneath the city over centuries. Burial sites for Christians, Jews, and pagans alike, carved deep into the rock. And hidden there, among the niches and loculi, are a different kind of mummy, unwrapped, unadorned, but preserved by environment and devotion. These are the linen-bound dead of the Nile, their bodies laid in carved alcoves, dried by time. Surrounded by symbols, you pass a faded painting, a fish, a dove, a shepherd. The early Christians used secret codes to mark graves, to leave messages, to remind the faithful who dared to walk these tunnels in secret that they were not alone. Historians still argue about how organized the early catacomb burials really were. Some believe they were coordinated by the early church. Others think families simply carved what space they could find. Either way, the result is vast. By the time Christianity became legal, there were thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of bodies buried beneath Rome. And though most have long since decomposed, some, through the strange alchemy of air, stone, and time, became mummified. Not intentionally, just preserved by the steady coolness, the lack of oxygen, and the dry embrace of the tough walls. But it's the art that makes this place whisper. Tiny frescoes, hastily scratched Greek letters, symbols still debated by scholars. Is that a simple circle? Or a disguised reference to the resurrection? A name? A code? One chamber, long forgotten and rediscovered only in the 1800s, features a series of paintings showing a banquet. At first glance, cheerful. On closer inspection, perhaps something more. The figures wear strange expressions. Their limbs blur into one another. Scholars still debate whether it was symbolic, depicting heaven, or a warning of gluttony, or even a reference to secret rituals. You touch a patch of wall that's colder than the rest, moist, and just faintly etched, a palm frond, a symbol of martyrdom. Or maybe peace, maybe both. Because these underground cities weren't just graves, they were sanctuaries. In times of persecution, believers hid here, worshipped here, died here. And the bones that remain, they carry that tension. A life lived in fear and hope, etched into stone by hands that shook with faith. And when these catacombs were later excavated, not always gently, many of the remains were removed, relocated to churches, reburied in ossuaries. Some ended up behind glass, boxed and displayed, and others became the catacomb saints. If that sounds dramatic, it is. In the 16th and 17th centuries, as the Catholic Church sought to reclaim its ancient glory, they exhumed skeletons from the Roman catacombs, dressed them in fine fabrics and jewels, and sent them across Europe as relics. Gilded skulls, silk-wrapped femurs, bejeweled ribs, all supposedly saints. Though in truth, few had names. Historians still debate whether the church knew these were anonymous remains. Whether it mattered, faith, after all, can be assigned, so can sainthood. And so catacomb mummies, accidental, unnamed, were transformed into symbols of divine beauty, paraded through towns, installed in altars, worshipped. You imagine a small village in Bavaria, the 1700s, the church doors open, and inside, beneath stained glass, a mummy glittering in gold lace lies still in a glass coffin. A girl kneels in prayer beside it, unaware that the bones she adores belonged not to a saint, but to someone who simply died. Quietly beneath Rome, there's something beautiful in that, and something unsettling. Because again, the dead were used. Elevated, yes, adored, but removed from context. Their stories lost, their names replaced. You brush your fingers across another carved niche. This one is empty, a hollow waiting for memory. And as you walk on, deeper into the catacombs, you wonder how many more are still here, not cataloged, not stolen, just waiting, wrapped in symbols, clothed in dust. Watching the centuries pass, one footstep at a time. Your footsteps fall softer, now muffled by the dust that has been gathering here longer than some civilizations have existed. You reach out to steady yourself against the uneven wall, where someone, long ago, carved a cross so faint it's barely there. And suddenly the tunnel narrows again, not claustrophobic exactly, but intimate, like walking through the inside of a memory. But this one isn't Roman, and it doesn't smell of incense or stone. It smells of salt. You're beneath the desert now, in the heart of Peru, where mummies lie not in grand tombs, but in open pits. Arms folded, hair intact, eyes wide. This is the legacy of the Chinchorro people, one of the world's earliest known cultures to practice mummification long before the Egyptians. And unlike many other societies, they didn't just preserve the elite. They preserved everyone, children, the elderly, even stillborn infants. It wasn't a privilege, it was a cultural duty. You kneel beside a shallow bundle. The body inside is over 7,000 years old. You can still see the painted black on its face. The limbs carefully wrapped in reed and clay. No gold. No hieroglyphs, just care. Historians still debate what drove the Chinchorro to begin this practice so early. Was it religious? Social? A fear of letting go? We may never know. But what's clear is this. They loved their dead, and they wanted them to stay close. Many of the mummies were kept above ground, inside homes or small huts. Imagine sharing your dinner by firelight while your grandmother sits silently in the corner, her hands bound, her face painted, her presence a link to the beyond. Not eerie, not strange, just normal. Time passed, and the desert helped. The arid climate, combined with salt-laden soil and ocean winds, preserved their bodies so well that even internal organs remained intact. Eyebrows, lips, delicate strands of hair. It's as if time just stopped. But then came the outsiders. When European explorers arrived in South America, they weren't looking for mummies. They were looking for gold, maps, conquest. The Chinchorro were already long gone, absorbed by other cultures, but their mummies remained. And soon they were taken, crumpled into crates, smuggled out in pieces, or worse, left out in the open, where scavengers and tourists disturbed them. You pass what looks like a rib, wedged between two stones, too clean, as if someone had picked it up and put it back, unsure of where it belonged. For a while, no one seemed to care, until scientists in the 20th century realized the truth. These were the oldest intentionally mummified remains on Earth, older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, and yet barely protected. It wasn't until the early 2000s that serious preservation efforts began. Still today, the Chinchorro mummies are vulnerable to looting, erosion, and the slow fade of memory, but they persist. Because the desert, like time, is patient, you turn into another alcove smaller than the last. This one is a kind of shelf carved into the earth, perfectly sized for a human body. And inside, a man lies curled, knees to chest, arms wrapped tight around himself. Not posed for glory, not laid out with riches, just cradled. As if asleep. There's something profoundly humble about the Chinchorro burials. No ceremony. No priesthood. Just people preserving those they loved. And that simplicity feels honest. You wonder what they think of what we've done with their ancestors, the museums, the studies, the photos and textbooks, the way we call them artifacts instead of relatives. It's a strange thing, isn't it? How some mummies became gods. Some became medicine, some became fertilizer, and others, they simply stayed, waiting quietly in the sand as centuries rose and fell around them. And now here you are, a visitor, a whisper in the vast timeline of the world. The man in the alcove doesn't speak, but somehow he tells you everything. That death isn't the end, that memory is fragile, and that the truest kind of immortality might not come from pyramids or glass coffins, but from love. From someone, thousands of years ago, taking the time to clean the body, wrap the limbs, paint the face, and place it gently in the ground, hoping that whoever came next would understand. The sand crunches underfoot now, softer than before. It carries warmth, even in the dark. And as you rise from the coastal deserts of Peru, you shift continents again, drawn toward another unlikely place where the dead remain. Not through wrappings, not through resin, but through something altogether stranger. You're now in Italy, though not the polished villas of Florence or the bustling lanes of Naples. You're below a sleepy Sicilian city, and below that, a monastery, and below that, a crypt filled with mummies standing upright. The Capuchin catacombs of Palermo. You can feel the temperature drop again, and this time the coolness isn't just geological, it's spiritual. A reverent, eerie hush that clings to the space like incense residue. You turn a corner, and there they are. Rows upon rows of mummified monks, lined neatly along the walls, some still in their robes, others holding the shriveled pose of peaceful devotion, palms together, heads bowed. They're not in cases. They're not behind barriers. They're just there watching. The Capuchins began this unique preservation practice in the late 1500s. Initially, it was simple. One monk died. The soil was too damp for a proper burial. So they hung him to dry, literally, and somehow it worked. Whether by luck or divine design, the body dried without rotting. The skin toughened, the features preserved, word spread. Soon, other monks wanted the same fate, to remain visible, present, connected to their brothers in death as they had been in life. Historians still argue whether the mummification was a spiritual aspiration or a practical adaptation. But what's clear is that over the next few centuries, the practice expanded. From monks to priests, from priests to patrons, from patrons to prominent families, and eventually to children. You pause at one tiny alcove, inside a glass coffin, laced with velvet, adorned with faded flowers, and inside it the most famous of all the catacomb mummies, Rosalia Lombardo. She died in 1920, just 2 years old. Pneumonia. Her grieving father, desperate to preserve her beauty forever, paid an embalmer named Alfredo Salafia, who used a formula so effective it kept Rosalia looking almost alive for over a century. Even today, her skin is soft, her eyelashes visible, her cheeks still rounded. They called her the Sleeping Beauty of Palermo, and visitors still weep when they see her. You imagine kneeling there, seeing her peaceful face under the glass, and wondering whether preserving grief so perfectly brings peace or pain. But Rosalia is just one among thousands here. In total, the Capuchin catacombs hold over 8,000 corpses, each one carefully arranged, each one assigned a space based on status. Priests in one corridor, professionals in another, women lined up according to age and virtue, children laid gently near the altar. You walk down a hallway where several skeletons still wear their 19th century best. Lace gloves, hats, even shoes. Time has curled the leather and browned the lace, but you can still see the pride. These people chose to be preserved. Or at least their families did. It was a sign of wealth, of status, a final performance of elegance. And yet now, they stand quietly, staring into eternity, while tourists shuffle past with smartphones and whispers, one hand outstretched, one mouth permanently agape. A frozen laugh, or the final sigh. Scholars still argue how intentional some of the postures were, whether monks arranged the bodies for effect, or whether the slow sag of time warped their last expressions. You walk past one man slumped in a seated pose, as if exhausted even after death. Another leans forward, forehead resting against his knees, a statue of surrender. It's easy to forget sometimes that mummification isn't just about preservation, it's about presentation. Whether wrapped in linen, painted in resin, or hung in robes, each culture has chosen how the dead should be remembered. In Palermo, that memory is visceral. There's no wall between you and the deceased, no euphemism, no abstraction, just bones. Fabric, eyeless sockets, silent witnesses to the centuries. And as you turn the last corner, you come upon a mirror, framed, tarnished, hung low on the wall, no label, just a reflection. Your reflection. A quiet reminder from the monks, perhaps you too will join us, not in fear, but in fact. Because time doesn't pause, it just changes shape. And maybe, just maybe, preservation isn't about resisting decay. Maybe it's about embracing the stillness. The moment just before the end, captured forever. The stillness follows you, now clings like a second skin as you leave the corridors of Sicily behind. But you don't climb back into sunlight just yet. You go deeper still, beneath another city, into a place where mummies were not made to be seen, not put on display, and certainly not meant to be remembered by strangers. You're beneath London now. Not the glittering towers of today, not even the foggy streets of Dickens' day. But under all of that, buried in the deep dark belly of the city, lie the forgotten mummies of British museums. You'd think maybe that a mummy placed inside a museum would be honored, labeled, researched, documented. But many weren't, because during the height of empire, when Britain looted artifacts across the globe, mummies were just another acquisition. And museums, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, weren't temples of knowledge. They were curiosity cabinets, power displays. And so mummies were unwrapped in drawing rooms, displayed in glass without names, shipped in crates like furniture, or stored away entirely stacked in basements, cellars, archives. You're now in one of those cellars. It smells of dust, old varnish, and the faint tang of neglected linen. No lighting here. Just the glow of a flickering bulb swinging slightly overhead, casting shadows across unmarked wooden crates. Inside them, bodies, wrapped, crumbled, unknown. In 2020, researchers estimated that hundreds of mummified remains sat in museum storage across the UK, many without proper records. Some collected during colonial expeditions, others donated by wealthy gentleman scientists. A few simply appeared, their origins lost, mislabeled, or dismissed as too difficult to trace. Historians still argue whether these collections should be returned to their countries of origin or whether the logistics are too complicated to untangle centuries of displacement. But you know this, in life, these people had names, families, burial rites, and now their inventory. Numbered, filed, sometimes wrapped in archival plastic, sometimes not. You step beside one crate. A label reads, "Unidentified mummy, early dynastic period, ? Because even the experts aren't sure. They can't agree on date, or origin, or sex, or significance. And so the mummy sits in a box with a question mark. You wonder how many others there are, not just in London, but in Berlin, Paris, New York, whole wings of museums devoted to ancient civilizations, often featuring objects acquired under very modern exploitation. Remember that Victorian craze for mummy powder? That passion for unwrapping parties? The need to touch, possess, consume? Well, that spirit never really died. It just got institutionalized. You pause in front of another crate. This one is open. Inside, you see the faint impression of a face. The linen has mostly disintegrated, the body shrunken, but there's something unmistakably human still clinging to the features. A life once lived, now boxed between bubble wrap and red tape. And then your light catches something, a label long faded, peeking from beneath the edge of the crate. You kneel, carefully lift the cloth, and read, "Donated by L.T. Call, James Weatherby, 1873, acquired at Thapes." No mention of how. No records of permission. No story of who this person was. You sit with that for a moment, because for all our talk of reverence for ancient civilizations, so much of it is built on theft, on taking what was sacred and making it interesting. And even now, as museums reckon with their colonial past, many of these bodies remain unreturned. Their families long gone, their tombs broken, their stories silenced, but you hear them in the quiet hum of the underground, in the stillness of the air around you, in the delicate way the desk curls upward when you shift your weight. You see, even in forgetting, Something remains, a trace, a whisper, the outline of a name once spoken by someone who loved them. And you wonder, if you were placed in a box in a place that didn't speak your language, your gods, your stories, would you hope for someone to open the lid, pause, and whisper hello, even if it's been 3,000 years? The air above London is thick with rain and streetlight, but deep below, where time slows and voices echo, you emerge from the cellar of forgotten crates and descend into an even more surreal layer of mummy history. Not a tomb, not a museum, not even a crypt, a stage. Because once upon a time, mummies weren't just studied, they were performed. You walk now through a dusty Victorian theater, long shuttered, where the red velvet curtains are moth-eaten, and the footlights haven't glowed in decades. But you can still hear the echoes of clapping, of gasps, of whispered fascination. You're back in the 19th century, a time when Egyptomania had a firm grip on Britain and Europe, not just for scholars or museum curators, but for the general public. And what better way to feed the obsession than by unwrapping an actual mummy on stage? Yes, this really happened. Historians estimate that over 300 public unwrappings took place during this craze, often billed as scientific lectures, but in truth, they were spectacle. Imagine it. You sit in a crowded London lecture hall. The gentleman on stage, perhaps a doctor, perhaps a showman, steps forward with a flourish, gesturing to the ancient figure on a table before him. Wrapped in linen, bound for eternity, now on display like a stage prop, and then the unwrapping begins. Layer by layer, the linen strips fall like petals to the floor, revealing brown skin, brittle fingers, occasionally even jewelry or amulets. The crowd leans in, some fascinated, some horrified, all utterly captivated. One famous showman, Thomas Pettigrew, a surgeon, made a name for himself doing these shows. He called it mummy unrolling, and while he claimed it was for science, he was also publishing books, selling tickets, and drawing crowds. He wasn't alone. Mummy theater became a fixture of society. The aristocracy threw private unwrapping parties. Parlors filled with cigar smoke and silk dresses gathered around a centuries-old corpse like it was after-dinner entertainment. Historians still argue whether the attendees truly understood what they were witnessing. Some accounts describe reverence, others flippant curiosity. You walk through the wings of this imagined theater, past stacked crates labeled with dates and destinations, and you realize these were not just bodies. They were turned into events, narratives, no longer people but symbols of mystery, of conquest, of distant, exotic death. And when the shows ended, many mummies were discarded, some kept as novelties, others sold to collectors, and a few, yes, really ground back into powder and sold as souvenirs. The performance in the end was always about power, taking something sacred, something once laid to rest with ritual and belief, and peeling it apart for applause. You sit now in one of the old theater chairs. The wood creaks beneath you. Dust motes swirl in the stage light. You look up at the empty platform and imagine it, the moment when the final linen is pulled away, and the crowd holds its breath. What did they feel? Wonder? Guilt? Nothing at all? You can't ask them, but you can ask yourself, because fascination with the dead isn't new, nor is the urge to control what we don't understand. It's just human. You leave the theater quietly. Backstage, behind the heavy curtain, a final crate sits unopened. No one claps. No one watches. And in that silence, there's something that feels more honest than any show. A final act, never performed. You step out of the silent theater and into something even quieter, a cool breeze moving across open sand. It's still dark, but this darkness isn't underground. It's the pre-dawn hush of a desert that has kept secrets longer than we've kept calendars. You're back in Egypt now, but not in the pyramids. Not in Luxor or Karnak, or any of the tombs tourists whisper through. You're out by the edge, on the border of forgotten ground, because for every pharaoh laid in gold, there were thousands, tens of thousands of ordinary people buried with far less ceremony, and some of them, they're still out here. You walk along a ridge where archaeologists recently uncovered a burial field, unmarked, unplanned, sprawling with quiet chaos, no tomb paintings, no sarcophagi, just linen, dust, and the dry desert air, bone, hair, and time itself. 1,000,000. Perfect for preserving skin. Historians still argue how many of these informal burials exist in Egypt. Some estimate over 1,000,000. Yes, not kings, not queens, just people, farmers, mothers, children, laborers who may have worked on temples but would never step inside them. And here's the twist. Many of them weren't mummified intentionally. They simply dried out, wrapped in thin linen, buried shallow, left in soil that drank the moisture from their flesh and left a person behind. You crouch near one of the shallow graves. The form is curled on its side, knees tucked in, hands near the face, like a sleeping child. Peaceful, no monument, no inscription. Only time holding the body in its quiet grip. And yet, these mummies often confuse researchers because they blur the line between natural and artificial preservation. Were they trying to mummify, or was this just the result of climate and accident? One body might still wear beads, just a coarse wrap. Another, a few have traces of resin perhaps supplied by family members using local materials. Some were buried with pottery or tools, others with nothing at all. What unites them isn't technique, it's obscurity. You don't see their stories in museums. You don't read their names in books. They are the anonymous dead, the unrecorded majority. And yet they make up the true face of ancient Egypt, not the pharaohs. Honored, mourned, not the priests, but the people who watched the Nile flood each year, who carried baskets of wheat, who braided the linen that wrapped royal limbs. They were not forgotten by their loved ones. They were visited, not found, but time doesn't always protect memory. You run your hand along a piece of broken pottery. Faint black strokes curve across it, perhaps a name once, or a prayer, now legible, but still present. Some archaeologists refer to these fields as lost cemeteries, but they were never lost. They were just because no one was looking. Even now, when new graves are uncovered, there's debate over whether to excavate, whether digging up the past helps the present, whether we learn or just consume. You lie back for a moment, the desert still cool before the sun begins to burn. The stars above feel almost too sharp, like they're watching. And maybe they are, because if there's one lesson here in this field of unnamed mummies, it's this. Being remembered is not the same as being known. You can be placed in a museum and still be misunderstood. You can be buried in dust and still be loved. And somewhere in the world, a child may still carry a name passed down from one of these silent ancestors, never knowing whose bones still hold that name under the sand. The wind rises. The first edge of sunlight creeps along the dunes, and slowly, without ceremony, you rise, brush the dust from your hands, and walk on. The 1,000,000 mummies remain behind you, not demanding remembrance, just quietly existing as they always have. By now, you've walked through dust, tunnels, theaters, tombs. You've seen how the dead were celebrated, hidden, even exploited. But not all stories of mummies end in crypts or crates. Some end in fire. You're now in America, not ancient, not medieval, not Victorian, modern, sort of. You're standing beside a railroad, steam curling from an old iron engine, dusty hats, clicking boots, the clatter of coal shovels, and the rhythmic hum of machinery. And in the haze of all that industry, you hear a legend that mummies were used as fuel to power trains across the American West. Sounds absurd, right? But like so many strange footnotes in history, there's a glimmer of truth hiding in the smoke. The tale goes like this. In the 19th century, American entrepreneurs, some in Nebraska, some as far as California, allegedly purchased mummified remains brought over from Egypt and used them to fire steam engines. Why? Because linen burns hot and old bones are surprisingly dry. It was said that Egyptian mummies, shipped in crates as cheap filler or ballast, had little monetary value once arrived. So someone thought, why not burn them? Now historians still argue whether the story is true. Some claim it's just a myth, an exaggeration of the era's casual disrespect for ancient cultures. Others point to specific articles, like one from Mark Twain, who swore mummies were being shoveled into engines. Though knowing Twain, he might have smirked the whole time he wrote it. You step closer to the train. The furnace door swings open, glowing orange, and you imagine not coal, but the blackened shape of a bandaged limb tossed in without ceremony. If it happened, it wasn't common, but it's not impossible. After all, we know that in the same era, mummy wrappings were used to make paper. That's confirmed. A paper mill in Massachusetts proudly advertised its mummy paper in the 1850s. And as wild as that sounds, it wasn't even hidden. People wrote letters, grocery lists, maybe even love notes on sheets made from ancient funerary linen. So is it really so strange to imagine someone tossing a few extra crates of dried-out Egyptian corpses into a train furnace for convenience? It's grotesque, unthinkable, and yet deeply human. We take what we don't understand and we use it, even the dead. Especially the dead. You imagine the passengers on board, clinking teacups in the dining car, discussing westward expansion, cattle prices, the next town. They had no idea what was fueling their journey, or maybe they did, and just didn't care. But here's the twist. The story stayed. Passed down, repeated, laughed at, debated. It became part of mummy lore. Even museums mention it now, usually with an eyebrow raised. Because in the end, the story says less about mummies and more about us. Our ability to turn anything into fuel. To turn stories into spectacle. To turn remains into resources. You stand by the track, watch the phantom train fade into the night, and wonder how many other legends like this have drifted into smoke. The kind that can't quite be proven, but also can't be forgotten, and maybe, just maybe, somewhere out west, a few flakes of ash from a 2,000-year-old king settled into prairie soil, grew into grass, fed a cow, fed a man. And the cycle went on. You leave the scorched tracks behind now, ash in the wind, legends flickering out, and step into a place unlike anywhere you've been so far. Not Egypt, not America, not even underground. You're walking into a warehouse, a modern one, cement floors, fluorescent lights, that faint industrial smell of cardboard and metal dust. It hums with quiet efficiency. Shelves stretch higher than you can see. Scanners beep gently in the distance. But on these shelves are mummies, not displayed, not exhibited, just stored, stacked, cataloged. You're inside one of the largest archaeological storage facilities in the world, where human remains from countless digs are held in quiet stasis. Some have been here for decades. Others arrived just months ago. This isn't a horror movie warehouse, no cobwebs, no thunderclaps. It's sterile, systematic, clinical, but there's something eerie about it anyway, because each cardboard box marked human remains contains not just bones, but a story that hasn't been told. You pass a row of mummies, some partially preserved, some little more than a name and a case number. Many aren't even from Egypt. There are mummified children from Peru, wrapped burials from Sudan, bog bodies from Northern Europe, flesh preserved by peat and time. And while most institutions mean well, some of these individuals have been waiting for decades, for study, for return, or simply for someone to remember they're here. Historians still debate whether these remains should ever have been moved in the first place, whether science justifies the long-term storage of what were once sacred bodies. You open a folder. Inside, a photo, a short description, a list of measurements. No name, just a code. You whisper it aloud. No response, of course, but in the quiet, the sound feels heavier than it should. There are shelves here for mummies too damaged for display, or too unremarkable by museum standards to draw a crowd. They're not kings, not golden, not accompanied by hieroglyphics or myths, but they are people, a lock of hair still curled, a toe wrapped in brittle linen, a tooth chipped in a way that suggests years of chewing grain. You pause at one shelf. Inside, a body curled on its side, no longer than a child, the skin leathery, the eyelids sealed. You wonder who held this person when they died, and whether anyone mourned, because that's the strange tension of this place. It's filled with the dead, yet designed for the living. Researchers walk these aisles with clipboards. Climate control keeps the temperature just right. Security cameras blink overhead. And somewhere far above this room, someone decides when or if these remains will ever see sunlight again. It's strange you think how mummies were once dug up with wild abandon. Sold, displayed, burned, powdered. And now they wait in cool rooms under flickering lights, preserved, protected, but still paused. There are efforts, of course. Global conversations about repatriation, new ethics in archaeology, indigenous communities asking rightfully for their ancestors to come home. Progress is happening, slowly, carefully, but in the meantime, shelves keep filling, boxes keep arriving. And you wonder, what does it mean to be lost? Is it to be buried? Or to be held forever in a room where no one says your name? You rest a hand on a lid, offer the only thing you can, presence, attention, a small acknowledgement that someone once lived and is still somewhere. Then you keep walking past the shelves, past the scanners, back into the dark. You step out of the warehouse and into the open air. It's night now again, or maybe it always was. Hard to tell when most of your journey has unfolded beneath the earth in rooms where time clings to the walls like dust. There's a breeze. But tonight, the kind that carries forgotten things, stories, ash, whispers of linen. You're not in any one place now. Walk along the edge of a quiet desert where a million ordinary people were buried with nothing but the wind. You're in all of them. You then down the steps of a Victorian theater where someone once applauded the peeling back of sacred skin. You pass a train engine, still smoldering, still hungry. You arrive in a strange little room, and now the kind you've seen before in museum gift shops, half lit with glass cabinets and tiny gold plaques. But this one feels different. There's no crowd, no velvet rope, no exit signs or exit. Just one mummy on display, and no label, not even a number. Just a figure, wrapped in linen so old it looks like cracked bark. Face angled toward you, eyes sealed, almost peaceful, and you just stand there, because now you know. You know that this mummy might have once been part of a ritual, or a performance, or a paper mill, or a train ride. You know that some were buried in silence, others dug up with fanfare, others boxed. Some burned. You've seen them as relics, as resources, as entertainment. At the end of all this wandering, but now you see the mummy as one thing, human, not sacred, not magical, not monstrous, just human. Something quiet shifts. And in that moment, because for all the times we've taken, sold, displayed, consumed, the greatest mystery might be this: gently you join them. What does it mean to let the dead rest? Respectful. Historians still argue whether full repatriation is possible, whether science has more to learn, whether public fascination can ever be fully but you feel it now, the weight of centuries, the cost of curiosity, and you think of all those who were mummified not for glory, but for love, for memory, for ritual, so that anyone would hold on to who they were. You stand with them now, not above, beneath desert stars, not behind, just beside. And as the room grows dim and your thoughts begin to soften, you let go of the museum, of the myths, of the noise. You return to the silence beneath it all, to linen folded with care, to jars filled with sacred organs. It asks nothing more of you, to names whispered into tomb walls, to hands that once wrapped another's body for the long sleep of forever. And slowly, not as a relic, but as a listener, a keeper of breath. And quiet. Now, let the images slow, let them melt. Let the hum of the train fade into stillness, the dust of the archives settle once more. The linen wraps you now, not in silence, but in softness. A hush that carries centuries, without the need to speak them aloud. Somewhere, a mummy lies untouched, and somewhere else, a museum crate waits unopened. But here, right here, there's only the sound of your breathing, gentle and steady, drifting down like sand on stone. The past is heavy, but tonight it simply rests and welcomes you to do the same. So close your eyes and let the weight of all you've learned settle not as burden, but as warmth. The mummies are still with us, but tonight they are quiet, and so are you.